Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life Was Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Como. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we will be discussing the burial grounds of Ludlow throughout its history in Ludlow, Massachusetts. So tell us about some of the older burial grounds in the town.
All right, Ludlow has 7 cemeteries, and I'll tell you about them. It has no Jewish cemetery and no Catholic cemetery, but it compensates for that a bit because one of them is a non-denominational cemetery, so neither Protestant, Jewish, nor Catholic, but all comers. All right, so I'll tell you about the old burial grounds, some of the new ones, and anything unique about Ludlow's many burial grounds. And again, there's 7. So let's talk about some of these older ones for you. Okay, there's used to be 7, but right now there's 6. And what I mean by that, there used to be one called the Village Cemetery, which was around where the Hubbard Library is nowadays. It was also called the Jenksville Cemetery. It was found on Windsor Street, close to Chestnut Street. 475 bodies were removed in 1902 and moved to the Island Pond Cemetery. So it's gone. So there's now only 6 cemeteries. That was a big move. Now, if you ever go to Island Pond Cemetery, it's obvious where they are. They're right near the front after about 100 feet. And then there's a big separation between the modern and the old. So it's easy to replicate the Village Cemetery because it's right out in front there. Okay, there's also the Ludlow Cemetery, which is a Protestant cemetery. It's probably from about 1843. Right, it's rather easy to find. Now, there's a very peculiar one called East Old Cemetery, which is abuts the Liberty Cemetery, which is in Belchtown, right? And so you have 2 cemeteries, and the division line between the 2 is not very obvious. And yet, one's in Belchtown and one's in Ludlow. They straddle each other. For the Ludlow part, the Olds family lived here, and that's why it's called the East Old Cemetery. Old, in this case, is O-U-L-D. All right, there's also another peculiar one called the Sykes Cemetery, with a lot of Sykes family members there. You can call it a family cemetery. And it's from the year 1772. It's found on Munson Street. All right, there's also the Fuller Cemetery. And the Fuller Cemetery is very close to the Ludlow Cemetery. And this one is right next to the original Congregational Church. And that church is gone, but it was rebuilt at the same point. It's right next to the Ludlow Green. It's a very fun one to go to. It has some footstones there, but they're all taken out and put up against the back wall. All right. Now, the Ludlow is very peculiar because it has a couple of modern ones. And one of those modern ones is the Island Pond. So I'm going to, even though I mentioned that, I'm going to talk about that in the next question. All right. So I've gone through some of the cemeteries with you. One is gone. That's the Village Cemetery. 2 are modern. And you can call 4 being old. The Sykes, the East Old, the Fuller, and the Ludlow Cemetery.
And tell us about some of the more modern features.
Okay. Now, the modern ones are very peculiar because the Island Pond Cemetery, named after the pond next to it, has the remnants of the village cemetery right out its front. So when you're going through, you go about 100 feet of no burials, then you meet the old remnants of the village cemetery with 475 burials. Those were put there in 1902. Now the village cemetery is not an old cemetery, but they just wanted the space, and so they moved them that year. And they left the space, and then the modern ones are very set off from it. In the back of the Island Pond Cemetery is an enormous section of modern. And this cemetery is a non-denominational cemetery, so Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant burials can take place in this cemetery. Now, there's a brand new cemetery as of the year 2023 in Ludlow. It's called the Reservoir Cemetery. It's near the Springfield Cemetery, which is in the northeast sector of Ludlow. It's right out the front where there used to be a golf course, and they started up a new cemetery called the Reservoir Cemetery. There's already about 24 people buried there, even though it's only about 10 months later. And so it's going to fill up. And the reason why they need a new one is because the Island Pond Cemetery, which has been used now since 1902, has a main burial location for Ludlow people, is itself getting filled up. They had to start filling up Island Pond Cemetery's midsection, which used to separate the old from the new. They cut down a lot of trees there. So you have a new cemetery in Ludlow. Maybe you don't know that if you live in Ludlow.
And really quick before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, for more information or to sign up for any of his various tours, check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214 @yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun, educational outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, what about Catholic, Jewish, and Native burials?
All right. Interesting point. I'm glad you asked. The Catholic cemetery in Ludlow is the Island Pond Cemetery, but that's non-denominational. Now, there's a couple of beautiful Catholic cemeteries in Ludlow, and they're quite large, and so they filled those up quick. The people in Ludlow that are Catholic can also use other cemeteries around the area, inside of Springfield, for instance, the St. Michael's Cemetery, or in other locations. Jewish people, of course, like to be associated with their own synagogue's cemetery. Now, I don't know of any native burials yet in Ludlow, but almost every community in Western Massachusetts have Native American burials that have been found. I just haven't figured out where Ludlows are or were found and where they were placed after they're found, because they do rebury them afterwards in most cases. So I hope to learn more about that feature.
And is there anything unique about Ludlow's burial grounds?
All right, I think the really unique aspect of their burial grounds is how they're separated out geographically. That's nice to see. So, like, you have the Ludlow Center Cemetery with a lot of the old-time burials of the western, especially northwestern sector. You have the cool village cemetery that was moved in 1902 during the American cemetery movement period that lasted from about 1880 to about 1910, and how it's separated uniquely inside of the Island Pond Cemetery itself. And I love the Island Pond Cemetery because of that division, and because it's next to a very large pond where it gets its name for himself. And then it has that cool cemetery that abuts Liberty Cemetery in Belchtown, where you don't know what stone belongs to what community unless you have a sharp eye. I went to a very similar cemetery in Collins, Connecticut, where they had two burial grounds that were supposed to be divided from each other, and yet it was hard to figure it out. So this is actually a common thing to have those. So I hope you read my podcast, read my text on the Ludlow cemeteries. I have a lot of pictures to help you out, and I hope to have a presentation at some point to guide you through all the nuances.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on the tours and historical topics of your expertise. And we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And check out a large selection of our other podcasts at his website, as well as on SoundCloud.com. And be sure to stay up to date with new podcasts and videos posted daily. Thank you, and hope you join us again. Very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Como. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we will be discussing the Island Pond Cemetery, located in Ludlow, Mass. So who is the first person buried in this cemetery?
Alright, a person named Ezra Parsons is the first person. He died in 1818. That was probably the start of the Island Pond Cemetery. It's not the oldest cemetery in Ludlow at all, but it has a very old part to it, so keep that in mind. And a lot of that old part is near this burial, which is towards the front right. A lot of the old ones are also towards the front left. So keep that in mind. And what we're going to talk about today are some of the stones here, including some fallen ones. And we're also talking about the structure of the cemetery itself. And we're also going to talk about some of the other features that might be in the cemetery of interest to you. Now, it's easy to find because it's about 200 feet away from the exit point or entrance point of the Ludlow Turnpike, the Massachusetts Turnpike and the Ludlow exit. So easy, it's a little bit towards the north and you're there. And it's good to go in there because it's an enjoyable place. It has an old and modern part. It has a lot of cool features around. Now, if you want to find Ezra, he is buried on quite near a grove of trees, and his stone is mostly pointing at this point towards maybe the northeast, I will call it, which is not quite the right position. He should be have the tablet point towards the west. He's quite far away from that. His wife is buried next to him, and I think one of their daughters there too. It's one of the few brownstone tablet gravestone within the cemetery. So if you look around for that, about 200 feet into the entrance, you'll find him. So it's always good to find that first burial.
And what names are on the fallen stones?
Alright, there's a roadway going down the middle of the cemetery, and there's, of course, some offshoots from there. But on that main roadway, not on the other side of the road from Ezra himself, you're going to find 6 collapsed gravestones, all made out of marble, all very white. They're probably upright in recent years. It probably was a rainstorm went by, and in this little area probably caught a rivulet, and it started knocking stones over. So the name is Fisk. And I'm pretty sure there's someone in Ludlow fixing up stones, because I see many of the stones are now whiter than usual and upright. So there's something to fix. But the entire Fisk family is down, except for 2 stones. And 2 of those fallen stones have broken into 2 pieces. And so when they collapsed, they broke a couple of them. So, the reason I'm telling you is because it's very strange to see almost a whole cemetery in very good condition, but then one whole family's knocked on the ground. And I think it's the water that did this.
And really quick, before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, for more information or to sign up for any of his various tours, check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and texts of the historical sites throughout as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214 and his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. Getting back to our interview, tell us more about the structure of the cemetery.
The old part is towards the front entrance. There is a back entrance too. I think it's called Chapin Street, and that's where the modern burials are mostly. So most people would probably be interested in the old. And towards the old side, there's one big loop on each side of the old part. And it'd be good if you walked around each one of those. And it's very interesting because it tends to be the ones on the left-hand side tend to be pointing in the correct direction towards the west. And the ones on the other side are pointing the wrong direction towards like the northeast. At least the old stones are. And so all burials pre-1860 in Protestant cemeteries would have this tablet, main headstone tablet, pointing towards the west, and the footstone pointing inscription east. And so if you go in between them, you can see no inscription at all. In this cemetery, not many footstones around, but a lot of headstones, and some point in the right direction. Now, there's one whole line of tablets that are in one family, and I think I counted at least 30 stones from the same family. So that's one very interesting thing to find. See if you can find out those stones. And one last thing that I mentioned about this old part, there is an old stone that is devoted to military personnel. And it seems to be for military men that enlisted in the British Army and Air Force during World War I or World War II. It has OSC on the base of it, and then underneath that a cobblestone base says 1915. And it says in memory of, and then it has Alexander Carsill, died 1914. Private Miller of the Canadian Expeditionary Forces, killed in France. And then a Charles Craigie, killed in action when he was 21 years old, 1945, so that's World War II. And then a person that wasn't killed in the war. So I'm wondering what this is mean. Why is the base of it saying OSC? And then it has a man's name in the military. I still haven't figured it out. It's hard to figure out by a simple search. So I'm going to have to really look into their death records and their lives. But you should visit that too.
And what are some of the features of the cemetery?
Okay, towards the front, there's a armament gun that probably was, by the look of it, a World War II gun. So it's nice to see. There's also a nice sign out front, and then there's a green space of at least 100 feet that they give you. And there's a veteran stone that says, thanks to all the many veterans of Ludlow. And then it starts in with the old parts. Now, I mentioned a lot of features about the old part. The back part, the modern part, is also very nicely structured. And they tried to make it look like a garden-style cemetery in the very back. But it's not truly that, but it's done in that manner. So it has a lot of flower beds, nice bushes and trees there. And so it's one of those pleasant kind of garden-style cemeteries. But the front is not. That's in the typical churchyard and lawn-style cemetery. So there's a lot to do and look around, and I encourage you to walk around. There is one weird structure, an obelisk, that lost its top. It only has its base, and it still has the metal support rod sticking out of it. So that's something else to find out. So thank you for listening to this podcast.
Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life Was Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Como. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations throughout communities in the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tour spotlight on the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various streets, parks, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the Village Cemetery, located in Ludlow, Massachusetts. So, where was the Village Cemetery of Ludlow?
Alright, this village cemetery was in this section of Ludlow that became industrialized, where the canal was put in, and the big the Ludlow manufacturing companies that made jute and twine were. It was basically what people may call downtown Ludlow. And it was in a village called Jinksville. Okay, we're going to talk about the very early on years of this wonderful cemetery, and then why it was even moved, because it's not there anymore. And then what was the last burials? Okay, so it was found on Windsor Street, close to Chestnut Street in Ludlow. And I put a very old map on my webpage for this so you can get to see exactly where it was. It was on what was then a dead-end street in downtown Ludlow, right up the street from the Union Church. And that that street has turned into Windsor Street by now. And the place that the cemetery is put, you might expect they'd move it and put something important there, and yet I don't see much of importance there at all. So you have to wonder why it was moved at all.
And what is the early history of the cemetery?
Alright. The first burial inside this cemetery was probably Ezra Parsons. He is now in the Island Pond Cemetery, where most of the bodies were moved. Ezra Parsons died in 1818, so he is the oldest burial in that Island Pond Cemetery. He is probably the first burial that we know of inside of the village cemetery of Ludlow. And his cemetery stone is fairly easy to find. It's in the old part towards the right center and next to a very old tree. And he has by far the oldest looking stone. His wife is buried right next to him. So early on, this cemetery was used very heavily, obviously from 1818 and until everything was moved. And it probably had about 475 burials within it.
And really quick, before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, to find out more information or sign up for any of his various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for other inquiries or just private tours, you can email him directly at bobcat4214 @yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, when, why, and to where was the cemetery moved?
Alright, in the year 1902, the cemetery was moved into the Island Pond Cemetery in Ludlow, which is not too far away from here, maybe a mile or so. And the reason why is very hard to understand, because not much was put in there. A road was extended, but there's so many roads in Ludlow. Why did you need to put a road right there? Was it possible to bypass this? It's very hard to tell. I'd like to find a story that tells you. And this cemetery was moved into the brand new Island Pond Cemetery, which was made in 1901. So the village cemetery was moved a year later, 1902, into a cemetery that was only 1 year old. And at that time, 475 bodies were moved, and approximately that many stones were moved. And it's obviously where they're moved to, because when you go into the Island Pond Cemetery, the first section you meet is the very old section in front, and that's where all the bodies that were moved were put into place. Remember, anything from 1901 onwards would have a very new-looking stone, and those are in the middle and the back section of the Island Pond Cemetery.
And who was the last burial in the village cemetery of Ludlow?
All right. In that village cemetery, they put in a man that had died in the year 1901. And that's why it's kind of strange, but they didn't know that they would actually move this cemetery. And why move a cemetery and why bury a person in 1901 in this village cemetery? All right, so the last person they put in there was a man named Frederick Briggs, and he died the 24th of March 1901. Right, and then the first burial ever put into the Island Pond Cemetery is that of a William Ewell, who died the 12th of September 1901. Right, so maybe the other cemetery wasn't ready, or maybe they didn't know they were going to move the cemetery at all. Okay, and so you have a strange situation, but someday I hope to solve why they were so sure that they were going to move it and why they couldn't just leave it there and build roads around it. So that is a mystery to us.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And you can check out a large selection of other podcasts on his website,